I mean, it feels good to be American, to have an American Pope now.
All of this is super ingrained into kind of religious doctrine and so forth.
The early Christians who came to America were trying to get away from the very thing that we're talking about right now, which is state control of religion.
The stance on business, on taxes, what's going on here?
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. My name is Sam Taylor. I'll be the host today. And the current date is May 11th when we're recording this. We're going to be discussing probably the most significant event that's happened over the past few days here, and that's the appointment of the new Pope. So I'm going to be discussing this with Jeff and Tania. Jeff is the CEO at Our National Conversation. Tania is our Director of Community, and both of them were raised Catholic. So it's going to be interesting to kind of get their perspectives on this new appointment and its potential implications. So, Jeff, why don't we start with you? Just general reactions to the new appointment here. I've heard people saying, on the conservative side, they're kind of hoping, okay, this seems to be a pope who's been more outspoken on kind of a traditional stance on various cultural and social issues. But then also I've seen clips of him wanting to, really kind of keep steady on reforms and kind of an opening up and welcoming atmosphere that was really championed by Pope Francis. So just reactions.
Well, let me start off in a Catholic tradition and make my confession here. Uh, I am what they call a C and E Catholic, and that stands for Christmas and Easter. So I generally go to church 2 times a year. Um, Sometimes I go to a local Presbyterian church down the street here. It's closer, and I think the service is a little more interesting. One of my issues with the Catholic Church is I think the services are boring. I just don't know how else to put it. And I wish they said more. But I'm actually going to go today, later today, because I haven't been in a long time. And with the naming of the new pope, I figured, okay, it's time to check in. Um, my reaction is, I think it's exciting, to have an American pope. We've never had this before. I have some friends from Chicago who are really excited, and they're sharing these memes of the Pope wearing the Pope's hat with Chicago Cubs logo or Chicago White Sox, or he's holding a deep dish pizza, that sort of thing. I think it's pretty hilarious, and I think people have been in a kind of a bad mood for in recent months, and they needed a little levity, so the Pope came along and supplied that.
Tanya, what's your reaction?
I mean, it feels good to be American, to have an American Pope now. That's for sure. But I would say that I do expect the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, to keep pace with his predecessor. I don't expect things to change greatly or significantly, but it feels great to be American, it really does. It's like the Olympics where suddenly it's very like USA all the time. And I remember seeing a hashtag floating around that was saying, make heaven great again, one prayer at one prayer at a time. So in a way, like I kind of, it for a small moment in time, we saw all Americans really rooting together and just being unified.
Well, that's interesting that you both bring this up because I had gone into this kind of after doing just very preliminary research on the subject, thinking, okay, like kind of in that binary fashion, like conservatives are saying this, progressives are hoping for this. What's the effect going to be? Just still in that polarized mindset. And I think it's easy if you're trying to engage in political analytics to do something like that and just ignore the wider picture. Hey, this is a unifying moment for Americans in general.
I think it'll be interesting. We do live in a very polarized time, and there's a lot of anger, which I personally find distressing. And it's really why we started our national conversation, is to try to tone things down and get people talking again. You're supposed to love thine enemy. That's one of the precepts that came from Jesus directly. So it doesn't feel like in America these days people are loving their neighbor or their enemy, and maybe the Pope can have an influence to try to nudge us back in that direction. Um, I do think if you're a Donald Trump or a JD Vance or Putin or anybody, when the Pope speaks, I think you have to listen. He has a certain moral authority and has a huge following. The Catholic Church has a lot of members all over the whole world. So um, I have to believe Leo is going to have some influence, and I am optimistic, and I think it'll be a positive influence.
Let's dive into that a little more in terms of the potential political influence here, because obviously, especially if we have kind of a situation like where Pope Francis heavily criticized a number of Trump policies, you can enter into a sphere where the Pope can be a mechanism for political mobilization, even partisan critiques, things like that. So I'm just curious. What are your thoughts on the potential political influence of this? Like, in terms of growing up in the Catholic Church, do you see relatives often consulting, okay, well, what did the Pope say on this? And that's going to be a big influence in how I behave on this issue. Do you see that sort of thing occurring? Does that not really occur in your spaces? Like, just what are your thoughts on this potential mechanism for mobilization or directing voting behavior?
Yeah, I mean, in the Catholic community, the Pope is, looked at as the direct successor of Saint Peter. So his word is holy. So what he says goes, right? So him saying, for example, let's say he looks down on gender ideology, which I think it's been rumored that Pope Leo the 14th has a very conservative take on this, right? So what he says goes. So we can see some open-minded Catholics suddenly being like, the Pope says it's bad, then it's bad. The Pope says us to question it, let's question it, right? And we have to also recognize that the Pope is the head of the Vatican City. This makes him very unique. He's not only a religious leader, but a political leader too. So what his actions can say not only influences the Catholic religion, but the political environment, right? And this is where I become very critical because I don't think the papacy should become political. I think the Pope's primary role should only be a spiritual shepherd and not a political activist. But I understand that the personal is political. Religion is inherently political, right? So I understand the text he takes, but I believe that a politically charged papacy can blur the lines between ideology and like eternal truths, right? Which just means like things on earth, right? And it could compromise the way we look at the church. And I really don't like it now that churches are very political, right? They use the religion to push certain ideologies. I don't think that's the way religion's supposed to be, which is why it has made me take a step back from a religion before, because it becomes too politically charged. I'm there for spiritual cleansing. I don't want to be told that um I'm going to burn in hell for being gay. I don't want to hear that. That doesn't make me feel good.
Hmm.
Yeah,
You
Jeff, your reactions to this.
you asked if anybody in my family was talking about this. I'm going to say everybody who was really hardcore Catholic in my family has pretty much died off by now. My grandparents, my grandmother, especially my maternal grandmother, my own mother. Um, but I grew up with it. When I was little, um, I remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president in 1960. It was considered um, almost impossible to conceive that a Catholic would actually become president of the United States. It was very controversial, and a lot of the Protestant bishops, raised a bit of a ruckus over this. And somehow or another, JFK transcended all this, and I think once he became president, that kind of put things to rest. Joe Biden was a Catholic, but nobody cared. So that's how we make progress in America. When somebody breaks
Mhm.
through the ceiling, the glass ceiling or whatever, then it makes it easier for others to follow. I I don't know. I think I agree with Tanya. I don't think a pope should be overtly political. I think the pope should be a unifier and somebody who gets us to come together. So if we have situations like in Gaza or Ukraine where there's war, I believe the Pope can play a role. He doesn't have to be a political figure, but just by getting people to think, is war really the answer here? Is this the way we're going to live out the rest of our days, is to be in a constant state of war? It gets pretty exhausting for the world, and I think most people don't like it. And if they could change it, they would. It's heads of state that start wars, generally speaking. So I don't know. I hope he can cause our leaders, Trump, Putin, etc., to rethink things a little bit and um, seek a different way, a better way.
Yeah, and just to build
So,
off Jeff real quick,
but
sorry, I don't mind to interrupt. Like, I think I also just want to clarify, like, going back to like Christian teachings and Catholic teachings, that there's an emphasis in love, compassion, and dignity for every human being. So, like, advocating for end of genocide isn't political, it's just, upholding the fact that everyone deserves to live and like the dignity of every human being. So, like, there's things like this, like those type of cases where I'm like, the Pope should say something because it isn't political. It's just calling out common sense behavior, being like, that's pretty bad. And yeah, just build on that.
Well, another hot button issue right now, of course, is immigration, people pouring across the borders coming into America. But the Bible states very clearly we should welcome the stranger. And it seems like we're not being very welcoming of strangers these days. I'm not sure what the ultimate answer is, because I do agree there's an issue here, and that America can't just absorb everybody who wants to come, and especially if they come over illegally in an unvetted way. You know, that raises all kinds of national security issues, and we need to be mindful of that. But I live in Los Angeles, and we have so many migrants here, and I'm just guessing, I don't know what percentage are legal or illegal, but I'm sure quite a huge number is illegal, and they contribute so much to our society. They are the gardeners, the domestic servants, the cleaning ladies. They run the restaurants. They're the cooks and the chefs. They do all the construction, and we really need construction workers right now, especially in light of the Palisades fire. I don't know why Americans on the conservative side have become so anti-immigrant. There's got to be control, and there's got to be less chaos, but I don't see how our economy can work very well if we get rid of them altogether.
yeah, yeah, no, very, very interesting and nuanced issue there, and we've actually discussed kind of immigration a little more in depth in other podcasts, and we can absolutely get into that if we want. But one thing that I want to touch on maybe a little more that you've both mentioned is trying to distinguish between the Pope as a political actor and the Pope as a spiritual leader, and to kind of try to demarcate maybe a little more clearly. Where one responsibility begins and ends, and where it maybe goes too far into an inappropriate sphere. So I'm just curious what you would both say to someone who looks at our political atmosphere, especially cultural and social issues, and says, no, all of this is super ingrained into kind of religious doctrine and so forth. The way maybe a family should look, or certain cultural issues. Tania, you mentioned various disputes on gender and so forth. Maybe immigration can be included in this, like what Jeff said, with certain notes there in the Bible. And I think maybe various religious conservatives or even religious progressives might look at the situation and say, no, my religion demands that I take this political stance or this partisan stance, or maybe I'm appealing to Judeo-Christian values or something. We hear this a lot, especially on the right, that our society's kind of founded on this value framework. And that's infused, maybe, or at least was originally infused with religious doctrine. So I'm just curious what you would say to someone who doesn't see that clear distinction, who says, you know what, my religion demands that I do these things, that I, believe X, Y, and Z, and to me, it seems that naturally leads to these political policy preferences and so forth, this voting behavior. Um, what's the response to someone like that?
I mean, I get very nitpicky. I say, well, the church says I can, like, my father can stone me if he can sell me, if they're gonna go very haywire of one particular scripture, you have to do the rest. Don't wear more than one thread of clothing. You know what I mean? They become very nitpicky with the Bible. And I was wondering, the way I grew up, I was never told things like being gay is bad, like, or immigration was bad, because in the way my church was, Christ never explicitly condemned homosexuality, right? These were interpretations that were brought upon us by King James, right? So with the way my church grew, like, raised me, is very much like love everyone, accept everyone for who they are because they are your brother, they are your sister. We all came from one father. To reject one is to reject all. That's the way I was taught. And then seeing individuals saying, oh, the Bible says a man should not lay with man here. I'm like, well, not really. If you have the like, quote unquote first edition, or you have ones that were interpreted by moral scholars, which just means like people who are here on earth and not from heaven, um, it's going to tell you that because it's fitting a certain platform, right? But I think ultimately that the Pope's, like, the mission of the church is to guide souls, not campaigns, right? Preach the gospel. Don't be preaching political platforms, right? So to see them using religion as a justification for certain political ideologies doesn't make sense. Because we also see people like J.D. Vance, let me pull it up real quick. We see how Pope Leo XIV push back on Vance's claim that Christians should love their family first, then their neighbors, then their community, and then their fellow citizens, and then the world, right? And we saw the Pope Leo, way back then when he was the cardinal, said that, well, God doesn't ask us to rank who we love. He just says to love everyone, right? And that's a very beautiful take on it. And it's very pushing back against what religious conservative says, which is basically rank who you love first, like rank who you would accept first, and that's not how it's supposed to be.
Thank you for that, Tanya. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
You know, I'm not a great historian here, but Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, when he was talking about the winding down of the Civil War, which was coming to an end, that both sides read the same Bible, but both sides came out with totally different conclusions about what the Bible was telling them to do. Is slavery good or is slavery bad? That was the issue of the day. I think today we'd all say slavery is bad. Maybe a handful
Hopefully.
would maybe a handful would secretly say no. Let's go back there. That's a good thing. Uh, but Tanya's right. In Scripture, if you look carefully, there's almost always something that will contradict something else. Now, in terms of the issue of gayness, I don't know. I have read the Bible. I go to a Bible study class every week, actually. And I don't know that anybody in the Bible ever comes out and says being gay is good. They definitely come out a few times and say being gay is bad. Um, but one of my friends says, hate the sin, love the sinner. He thinks being gay is a sin, but he doesn't hold it against the person. He says, we're not supposed to judge other people. That's for the Heavenly Father to do. It's not up to us as humans to render judgment on our fellow human beings. So I don't know. I help me out here, Tanya. What am I trying to say?
You know what? I think we're trying to say that not everyone's going to be as progressive as me, progressive as my church, but I think ultimately what the Bible is trying to say is just, be accepting of what you cannot change. And you cannot change if someone is gay. So you can accept it. Doesn't mean you have to approve of it, but just have to accept the way they're living. Right? I think that's probably ultimately what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, actually. You know, Jesus says often, the world is the world. And, Satan has a huge influence in the real world. And ultimately what we're supposed to be doing is living our lives in a way that will allow God to say, one day when we're gone, okay, you get into heaven because you lived a good life, or you don't because you led a bad life. But it's not up to us to make those judgments. That's for God to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that what I'm getting from this is that, and I think something Tanya you said really hits on this. It's that we have obviously the King James version of the Bible. There's more original scripts. There's all sorts of scholarship, and meetings that have gone into deciding, what this is going to be doctrine, this isn't, that sort of thing. Um, I think that, if you take the approach to religious texts and say, what, this may be the word of God, but it's filtered through human institutions and cultures. And, those things are variable. And, if you begin to give one of those things, the kind of cultural aspect, the contingent aspect, the historical aspect, the complete weight of eternal truth, that becomes maybe more problematic, and you start to see with kind of a more narrow focus, and maybe you say, what, the church should support this partisan perspective, but yeah, maybe that's starting to kind of take the institution for the religious doctrine. I don't know. Is that kind of what's being said here? At least one aspect of what you're saying.
Say so, yeah. I think you hit it right on it.
Got it.
Sam, you're just so smart. You pose these heavy, heavy questions that just go right over my head. It's hard to keep up with you here.
No, 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 no. This is what I get for going to BYU. There's a lot of talk on this sort of thing. I just think it's interesting. Um, Sorry, where were you going to say something, Jeff?
No, go ahead.
All right. Um, so yeah, I guess my next question is just on. We've kind of already hit on this a little bit. We've talked about this, a bit already, but I guess let's get into separation of church and state, and how to be a an appropriate religious actor in a democracy that is fundamentally committed to this separation, and I think rightly so. Um, so we've talked about how we probably shouldn't, have the Pope arguing very clearly for certain partisan perspectives and so forth. Should be more of a unifier. There's a lot of room for interpretation, maybe ambiguity in the Bible. There's room for contradiction, and maybe a lot of what we should be doing in a religious context is, as Jeff said, kind of hating the sin, not hating the sinner, accepting people, not judging people, not taking on that role, things like that. But it still seems that there's room for this. Me personally, given my interpretation of scripture, I think we should be more loving and accepting. So maybe I'm going to support this policy personally, that, engenders something like that. Maybe I support DEI, or maybe, something along those lines. And I draw personally from, my religious views to then support that view on policy. Now, what I'm curious about is, let's say a legislature just basically says, you know what, we're going to implement this policy, X policy, not because, the Pope said to or whatever else, but because, our values, which are rooted in this religion, leads us to believe we should be really accepting or open, or maybe, we adopt a more conservative view on the subject. Obviously, if a legislature were to state that really explicitly, that might start to violate separation of church and state. And yet, if it's more implicit, right? If it's just, this is influencing my moral views, which then influence my political views, it seems to be much more muddled. And yet, I think an argument could be made. Well, maybe that's also a violation of church and state. If you're only advocating for this policy because of your religious morality and so forth. I don't know. What are your thoughts there? Like, how do you engage effectively as a religious individual in, trying to balance the separation of church and state. I'm kind of formulating this question as I'm going, so I apologize if it's super vague and doesn't really mean anything to you. But yeah,
No,
just
no,
how do we
it's
approach
good.
this?
I would go back to the beginning of the founding of the republic. The early Americans, the pioneers, the pilgrims who came over on the boats. They were escaping religious control by the state. They'd
Hmm.
had enough of it, and so they came to America to be free of all that. So I think there should be freedom of religion. I don't think Christians should say, our religion is superior to that of Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or anybody else, and therefore, we should be the people in control because it was the early Christians who came to America. The early Christians who came to America were trying to get away from the very thing that we're talking about right now, which is state control of religion. I just think human beings aren't smart enough to figure this stuff out. There are certain mysteries that are left up to us to figure out individually with our own gods.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. Tanya, what are your thoughts on kind of this? Maybe we're not saying explicitly, I'm going to implement this policy because the Bible says so, but still, I have this moral view because my religion says, this. And because I have this moral view rooted in my religion, I think we should implement this policy. I mean, is that just a longer way of violating church and state? Or is that like, no, that's unavoidable. That's just how people function. Your religion influences your morality. And what can you do other than, you know, advocate policies that adhere to your morality? Like, I don't know, just what are your thoughts there? Or do you think, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I try to struggle to make sense of because, religion is an influencing factor in how we vote, who we align with, who we get our community from, right? It's hard to separate ourselves individuals, being like, oh, I go to church and core Christian teachings or love, compassion, and duty of every human being. How do I move that into politics? Well, we don't see them actually doing that. We don't see them trying to push policies about love, compassion, and dignity for a human being. It's actually very the opposite. It's saying, um, you know, let's not everyone have freedom of their body, right? Let's actually prevent people from seeking certain medical care. It isn't encapsulating love, compassion, and dignity. But then again, we see them, maybe quietly using religion as the foundational piece for that, right? I think it's problematic. I think if we've been too accepting of that type of narrative for far too long, where we don't really know when it becomes an issue of church and state, right? It's really blurry, it's really murky, it's confusing. Um, I think though ultimately that the core teachings are of love, compassion, and dignity are the ones we should be valuing the most when it comes to policy, especially as voters, right? But again, we don't see that happening. We really don't. So it's kind of hard to separate it. I wish we could. Maybe that's more my extreme view. I think religion should have no place in politics at all. I mean, I'm even pro take God out of the Constitution. I'm very much pro that because I think that if we're very much leaning to one religion, we risk alienating those who don't believe, or we risk alienating those who just don't align with certain beliefs within the Catholic teachings or Christian teachings. And that's not how we're supposed to be doing. You know, Political engagement and politics is about, okay, I wouldn't say about unity, but I would say it's about making sure everyone's participating. But if we're only very much saying, oh, we need to make sure we have Christian teachings, Catholic teachings within our laws. Well, what if I'm Muslim? Like that's gonna make me feel very bad. I'm like, this is very much haram. Not me speaking for the Muslims, but like that's not gonna make me feel accepted in my own community or my own country. So I think I very much emphasize the separation. I don't think we should be really using religion as a, piece of evidence for a certain policy or legislation. I think the values of love, compassion, and dignity, yeah, 100%. But if you're gonna come here and tell me Bible says no gay people, so no gay people, well, I'm gonna say okay, you're gonna let your parents stone ya. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, my dad can sell me if he wanted to per the Bible. are we accepting of that? No. Then again, we're like very nitpicky with it. So I'm just saying the core values of love, compassion, dignity are what we should be holding up. And it's not very loving if we're, uh, very anti people.
One thing
Thank you.
I have
Oh, go ahead,
struggled
Jeff.
with over the years, I have some very conservative friends. I have some very liberal friends. But the conservative friends right now seem angry. They don't like the way things have unfolded in America in recent decades. It could be DEI, it could be anything. But one of the things that they seem to like is the idea that we should all bear arms if we want to. And you know, I just have a hard time picturing Jesus ever giving a sermon saying, "Everybody go out tomorrow and buy an AR-15 because I think it's cool." It just that's not who Jesus was. And we live in a very violent society, and a lot of people are highly weaponized. We have something like 300 million guns in America. That's almost as many guns as we have people. Is that what God wants us to do? I just have a hard time believing that. Um, but how do you get people who are really conservative to rethink the role of guns in America?
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting issue, and it goes back to what we've been talking about earlier. It's different interpretations of the same text or the same cultural milieu that stems from those texts. Um, it's yeah, I'd imagine, if you're conservative, maybe you look at this and say, well, um, Jesus certainly didn't preach go and get AR-15s, but maybe there is a role of maybe there's a time and a place to fight against something like tyranny. And I know a lot of conservatives say one of the reasons we have the Second Amendment is, in case the government encroaches on freedom, to such a grave degree, the people need to have a kind of the fallback of, maybe we take up arms as necessary. Um, so maybe you can get a religious justification for something like that, or fighting for your religious freedoms, etc. But I mean, even then, that's not exactly the route that occurred, in um, ancient Judea, under the Roman Empire and so forth. But maybe you could also make the argument it's different time demands different things. I think it's one of those issues. There's just a lot of ambiguity, a lot of room for interpretation. As has been said before.
I mean, something you said, something that really triggers in my brain. It says there's this kind of narrative that a lot of like really conservative religious individuals believe is that there's a war on Christianity. But I mean, there's no Crusade 2.0. You know what I mean? So like, I don't see we're gonna be really gung ho about it. But I don't think there's ever going to be. I mean, except First Crusades. But I don't think we're going through a Crusades 2.0, right? So very buckling down on religion isn't really going to do anything for us, and there's just no attack for it. I mean, controversy. This goes against kind of what Trump and JD Vance are saying, but when they say there is a war on Christianity, no, I think they're confusing tolerance and acceptance of other religions as a war, but it's really not.
You know, I'd like to weigh in on that one too, because my conservative Christian friends make this point often that we're persecuted because we're Christians. And going back to Jesus, he says, if you're going to carry the cross and go forward from here, there are going to be some tough days ahead. It's not always going to be a bed of roses. But if we live in America, which I think is primarily a Christian influenced country, I would much rather be a Christian in America than a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or anything else, because I think you could say those are the people who are truly persecuted in our society.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd
Based on
imagine it can
religion.
also vary by region, city, even just kind of your social circles can look very different. But as a general rule, I mean, just based on what I'm aware of various statistics, I'd imagine so. Sorry, Jeff, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, Sam, you went to BYU. I'm assuming you're a Mormon. I don't know much
Mm.
about what Mormonism is, but it seems like a lot of my Christian friends kind of look down their noses at Mormons, like they have some weird religion or something like that. So
Yeah.
you guys might feel persecuted, do you?
I think it depends on where you are. Going back to my point earlier, if you're in Utah, probably not.
Okay.
Maybe if you're in like the middle of Salt Lake City, which is very, very different from the rest of Utah. In fact, Salt Lake City was, I believe, ranked as one of the, if not the, like cities with the highest LGBTQIA plus populations, in America, which is kind of interesting that contrast compared to maybe more rural areas of Utah or suburbia. Um, so yeah, I'd say I haven't really experienced it much, but I haven't lived in a place where that's the minority, really, really extensively. So I'd imagine there's some of that there. And yeah, certainly historically, it has been kind of the oddball, black sheep or outcast among various, American Christian circles. So that there is a bit of that. I probably don't have time to get into all of the doctrine and so forth, but for the most part, it's very similar to other Christian religions.
When Mitt Romney was running for president some years ago, just as being a Catholic was held up as a question mark hanging over JFK's head, could America really elect a Catholic? The same thing applied to him. Was America ready to vote for a Muslim? And yet, I didn't vote for him, but he seemed like a very decent person. I think that's something that's really missing in America these days is just decency.
He was running. I don't know. Maybe this is like a unique immigrant child experience, but my mom and my dad have like made me help them do research on who to vote for, and his religion was never like a confounding factor for me. It was never like, oh, please, Mormon, put that in column A as the do or do not vote. No, I was very much just like, okay, what's his stance on business, on taxes, what's going on here? Like it was just never something that mattered to me and what religion they were practicing. It mattered to me their policy record. What mattered to me was their stance on immigration because I'm a child of immigrants. We're immigrants, right? It mattered to me what they stand for in terms of business and taxes because we were business owners, right? So religion was never a factor for me, and I don't think it'll ever be. Let's say a Muslim ran for president. I wouldn't be, oh, they're Muslim, column A, column B. No, it was more so, what's your policy track record? What's going on here? What have you been consistently able to do? And also, how much are you feeling the partisan divide? Are you too left? Are you too right? What's going on?
When Obama ran against Mitt Romney, I'm just now thinking back to those days. There were a lot of people who said he really wasn't Christian enough, and then there were others who said he was actually a Muslim. So I don't know. I think this is ridiculous. I think people should be allowed to self-identify the way they want in terms of their own religion and not have other people say, well, you're not really a good enough Christian or you're not even a Christian at all. This is something human beings do. It's not something God would do, I don't think.
Yeah.
So maybe going back just a little bit, because I'm just curious, and I kind of want to make sure I'm understanding this appropriately. So when we were talking about separation of church and state, and kind of how you engage with society as a religious actor, and kind of that step by step process. You know, Religion influences moral views, which then influence views on policy. Um, I'm just curious, is kind of the assertion that if we can kind of put religion to kind of more of a fundamental, sort of influence on morality as opposed to an explicit direct one, that's kind of the aim we're going for here. And that makes the situation better, makes it less of a violation of church and state, and kind of makes for a healthier politics. Like, say the difference is, I implement this policy because the Bible says this, and this is my interpretation of the Bible, versus I implement this policy because my morality dictates that I do that, and my morality is influenced by my religious views. But there's kind of that bridge in between. It's a little further back as an influence. I mean, is that what we're saying? Okay, no, that's what it should be. That's less of a violation of church and state, et cetera. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the assertion here, right? Because Tanya, when we're going back to things like loving people and human dignity and so forth, I absolutely agree. These are fantastic things, but I just think from a historical perspective, a lot of this, at least in a Western context, is rooted quite heavily in the development of certain, Christian doctrines and how they interacted with various Enlightenment principles, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can do an intellectual genealogy on that. I'm sure there's tons of
Mm.
controversy and kind of academic, ink spilled on the subject. But, it seems to me there's still some influence that's almost inevitably going to occur, if you're religious and you kind of hold these views. So, yeah, is the assertion that if you just push it back to a more fundamental level, that's what we're after, that's better, that's healthier? Or are you saying something else?
You know, when you were speaking, I had two thoughts come in my head, right? The first one is that, our love, compassion, and dignity inherently religious. Are those really things that only come from religion? Some people will say yes, some people will say no, and that's where, again, where it starts getting blurry again, right? Are those actually religious values? And then in the ideal world, would we value these values, or would people choose different values? In my ideal world, we would value love, compassion, and dignity, right? But of course, I think in we exist in a certain political, cultural, and social environment. So there's going to be limitations when it comes to this, right? I can love everyone, I can, emphasize dignity, but when it comes to immigration, I think we need to have more security. I think we need to be very careful about who we bring to the country, right? Some people would say that is not me being compassionate or loving or upholding dignity of people. But I think, again, we exist in a different state, right? We have to have a sense of security. We have to be very cautious and about who we're bringing into the country, right? So it does get kind of confusing, and also depends on what values we accept from the Bible that isn't inherently religious, but kind of is. It gets very confusing, right? I think ultimately, if we are going to take something, love, compassion, and dignity, but there are limitations. We just have to then come together and accept what those limitations are, right?
Yeah.
I think the way I'm going about it makes the most sense. But also, people will say I'm bonkers. They'll call me far left. But that's not really the case for me, but we'll see.
You know, in Jesus' time, he preached love and all that stuff. Forgive each other their sins, don't trespass on one another, but forgive each other when they do. Um, it was a very divisive message, actually. We talk about unity in terms of religion, but it was actually a really radical idea he was putting out into a world filled with hate and brutality. And to this day, it remains divisive. Because here we are now saying we love the idea of love thy neighbor, but does it actually happen much in the real world? Not nearly enough, I don't think.
Mhm. Yeah. No, there's absolutely a disconnect there. And just even in an American context with our rampant effective polarization, people just hating others, for their political beliefs and so forth. It's yeah, no, it becomes very dicey. Um, let's see, I was going to say, oh yeah, I just wanted to make a quick clarification. No, I think you're absolutely right, Tanya, that there's obviously going to be in some form or another in every culture and so forth some version or take on love, dignity, etc. I mean, some of these things are kind of more fundamental. But maybe an argument could be made that the way they've contributed to an intellectual formulation of ideas of human rights, etc., how that's played out in Western democracies, that there's a lot of history of Judeo-Christian influence there. I think that's what a lot of conservatives would argue. It's obviously, still kind of a controversial issue there, but yeah, no, I can see what you're saying in it becomes very muddled, confusing, and complex. And Jeff, I think you bring up a good point. A lot of it just, when we get down to these basic fundamentals of religion, we can sit here all day and talk about what a religion demands, what it doesn't, how it should properly play out in a society. But at the end of the day, it's do people actually adhere to that, right? Do they actually implement this in their day-to-day lives? I think that's probably the more important subject there. Um, anyways, any other thoughts on this subject before we conclude? We're kind of running out of time.
I would say, I was seeing some news, like articles before we jumped onto this meeting, how Pope Leo has, retweeted things that are very much going against the Trump campaign, right? Very much pushing back on his claims of anti-immigration and also pushing back on JD Vance's ideas on how we rank our love. The example I brought up earlier. Do we think Donald Trump is gonna be, hashtag Team Leo, or do we think there's going to be some controversy of him calling out the Pope or something like that? Do we think, and let's say we see Trump do that. We see, what if we see Trump call out the Pope, right? Become very anti-Pope. Do we think that's going to change how religious conservatives view Trump? Are they going to, go pro Pope Leo, who's, expected to do the same thing as Pope Francis?
If I could jump in on that one, I give Trump a lot of credit for being a brilliant politician. Whether you like his policies or not, he knows how to read the room. And I don't think he's going to do anything intentionally to anger the new pope. I think it's too risky for him. He doesn't want to alienate all the Catholics out there. I don't think. Now, I could be wrong, but that would be my prediction that they're going to do some sort of a dance here, and they're going to somehow learn to live with one another.
All right. Well, only time will tell. We can only speculate at this point, but we'll see how this all pans out. We'll see the influence of kind of Pope Leo the 14th, and we'll see how the broader discussion on separation of church and state, religion in America, etc., continues to play out. So, oh, Jeff, you
Yeah,
looked like you
yeah.
want to say
I
something.
want to ask Tanya a question. So there was that case some years ago. I think it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court about somebody who was asked to bake a cake for a gay wedding, and the bakery said, we don't want to do it because it runs contrary to our religion. We don't believe in gayness, and therefore we're not going to bake the cake. um I can actually understand that argument. If we believe in freedom of religion and freedom of thought and freedom of speech, that's a way to express it. I mean, the gay couple can walk right down the street and find somebody else to bake them a cake if needed, or they could bake it themselves. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think I'm off target on this one?
No, I think you bring up, that's a good example, right? And it's a lot, right? But I think I've seen a lot of people reference Citizens United, how a business is approached as an individual. So this individual has the right to say who they do not want to accept and make rules like that, right? So I think they had a strong case. I think they ultimately lost. If I'm remembering correctly, I think they ultimately lost, right? They had to bake the cake, or had to bake the cake, right? Do you know, Jeff?
I, Sam, help us out here. I don't recall exactly how that
I
resolved.
don't.
I think
I
it's
don't
gone
recall
back and
either.
forth. It's gone back and forth a few times, I think.
Hmm.
I maybe I think the last broadcast I saw is that they did have to bake a cake, or maybe that was a separate person,
Yeah.
and they were told to bake the cake. I don't know. It gets very confusing because again, Citizens United kind of changed everything and how we viewed businesses to be. Um, I I don't know. I really don't know. I really don't. Obviously, I think that that is discriminating against that gay couple. I do think it is, for personally, just because I grew up with a lot of gay people in my family. My brother's gay, so like I'm very much like LGBTQ rights, and very much like if you're telling a gay person because they are gay, you don't want to do something from them. I call that discrimination. I call them alienating a specific community, and I think that's bad. Not only bad for business, you're like if you play into that, you're set for life. Uh, but I also understand that businesses do have a right to deny service, right? But it gets kind of confusing. I really don't know how I stand. I think ultimately though, if you're going to not provide service because of someone's lifestyle, um, what's stopping other businesses from um, accepting or like denying customers because they're religious, there's certain religion attitude or how they look, right? I think there's certain lines we can't cross, but I also understand there's certain areas where lines get blurry. So it's kind of hard to like heavily have like really concrete stance on that.
Let me toss out one more. I know we're running out of time, Sam. But on the issue of abortion, you know, I know people say they're pro-choice, but I don't think anybody is really pro-abortion. I mean, abortion is nasty business under the best of circumstances. You are ending a life, I think. And I do think life begins at conception. I mean, I don't know how else you can think of it because does it really happen like 6 weeks later or 12 weeks later or 24 weeks later? It started someplace and it starts with conception. So I think if you're terminating a pregnancy, this is something you ought to think about long and hard before you do it. And I also think, though, it's between you and God. I don't think human beings should judge each other or punish each other for these things. I think anybody who goes through an abortion situation is probably going to self-punish enough or feel punished by God. So I think human beings ought to be a lot less judgmental than they are. That's up to God.
No, 100%. And I think things like abortion, this is also where it gets kind of confusing for me, because for me, for myself, I'm pro-life. I would never do something like that. So I would never put myself in a situation and where I could run that risk. But for others, I'm like, I think I go with I believe it's the 8 weeks law, like rule, like it was under 8 weeks. Okay, I can't really put my own personal choice on someone. So if it's under 8 weeks, I think it's fine. Well, quote unquote fine.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard for me to make sense of that because, I will also go with you, Jeff. I believe life begins at conception, but I understand that's because of my own religious views, right? So I can't push it on someone else, and I refuse to do that. I refuse to say because I have this belief that I should prevent you, a victim of rape, to not get an abortion. You know what I mean? But I think it's kind of iffy when it's past 8 weeks. That's when I
Yeah,
kind
I
of go
know.
back and forth, but that's because of my religious perspectives,
Yeah.
and that's where it becomes difficult to make sense of. But I think ultimately, especially when it comes to cases of rape and incest, it'll take them a long time to come forward, right? And I understand that, so I
No, I,
think
I
there's
get that
has to
one
be some
too.
leeways with
I
that.
think there have to be some exceptions and some nuances here. And if somebody is going to abort, I think if they take a pill in the first couple of weeks, that's a whole lot more acceptable in my mind than waiting till month 7, 8, or 9, which apparently some people do. Not many, but when liberals defend that practice, allowing abortions in the final trimester, I think it hurts their own cause. I think it just gives fuel to the conservative side, which says that this is murder, and if the baby could live on its own after month 8 or whatever, and you're still aborting, there's something wrong there. I think.
No, I agree with you there. And I do also think, though, if we want to prevent abortions like that down the line, we need to have more accessible resources for contraceptives, right? Maybe California is very unique where there are a lot of resources, but we still see a lot of unplanned teen pregnancies. And then that's why we see a lot of abortions for that certain demographic. And I think it just comes down to removing the controversy or the taboo nature of sex, right? Like make it a normal conversation in the sense that you know where your resources are. You know what I mean? You go to CVS, you get a Plan B. Go to CVS, you can get a condom. Go to CVS, go to Target, and you can buy birth control without a prescription, right? I think, okay, maybe I'm being too charged with this, but I think there's a lot of resources people have that could make abortion their Plan D. But that's my own personal perspective.
No.
Gotcha.
No, there's so much to get into with. I mean, this, obviously, whole nother podcast. Off this, we could spend a whole podcast even on the cake situation and analyzing that, and how do you apply the law in different contexts? What if it's the only bakery in the city or something like that, or philosophical arguments on the nature of personhood, etc. Like, there's so much to get into, but unfortunately, we don't have time to get into everything in this podcast here, so we're gonna have to conclude here. But again, thank you so much, guys, for sharing your perspectives, for walking me through kind of how you're reacting to the latest developments here. And yeah, we'll hopefully see you guys on a future podcast.
God bless both of you, and God bless America.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.